Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another one of the online discussions and talks called Reframing Community-based Economies. It's a series of events that is being organized by Sirius Art Center with Cobh Zero Waste and the artist Colette Lewis, based in Cork City. Sirius Art Center is an organization based in Cobh, County Cork, and we've been developing a series of programs that somehow try to bring a more social conscious responsibility to arts to the organization and to institutions operating in the field of arts in general. This series of events have different formats. We've been organizing workshops. Sometimes it's a reading session, sometimes our talks. And today we have a talk by artist based in Scotland, in Glasgow, Ailie Rutherford. I think I'm pronouncing your name properly. If not, you can always correct me. And the rationale behind the project is to try to develop what we can call a critical mass. So a body of ideas and knowledges and toolkits around taking back the economy, using terminology, concepts put forward by a diverse group of scholars, probably the most well-known of which is Catherine Gibson, and a book that she co-authored a few years ago called Take Back the Economy is a fundamental element of that, but also other kinds of research that have been done. So following a sort of eco-feminist approach to economy and try to understand how we can look at economy today in a way that challenges capitalist principles. And our ambition is that this critical mass we're generating will enable us in the future to maybe implement some actions, artistic-led and civic-led in Cobh as a joint effort between an arts organization like Sirius Art Center, Cobh Zero Waste, and an artist like Colette and others. We've been inviting artists that have developed projects that somehow are part of this constellation of ideas, but also projects that we believe are quite relevant as case studies, first to share widely, and secondly as case studies for ourselves. So that's the rationale behind inviting Ailie to talk to us today, and she will do a presentation after which we'll have time for discussion. The discussions are sometimes very more general around ideas, but sometimes they are also very specific. So in a way that we almost use these presentations as a tool for us to reflect on our own work and how we can maybe progress with our own work. I think that's fine. Ailie, so I hand over now to you, and then we'll take it from there. You should introduce yourself a little bit, because I'm not doing that, and okay. Then the project and so on.
Hi, yeah, I'm Ailie Rutherford. So yeah, I'm an artist, come from a visual arts background. Most of the work that I do is very social and collaborative, and currently based in Glasgow in Scotland. So I'm going to talk about work that I've been doing over the past 5 or 6 years that is centered around ideas of community, currency, community economies, and feminist economics, and very much looking at how we take feminist economic theory, the kind of academic ideas, and what that looks like in a community context in real life, and in the very specific community context of Govanhill, which is in the south of Glasgow, quite close to where I live. I'm very aware that a lot of us are spending a huge amount of time on screen at the minute, and that is causing people quite a bit of fatigue. So I'm going to incorporate lots of screen breaks into this. I would really suggest, so every now and again, I'm just going to suggest that we have a minute or two screen break. I would really suggest that you take it as a screen break. Look away from your screen, close your eyes for a minute, try not to use it to check your phone if you can. I know that's not always possible, but yeah, I think I've been doing that a lot recently, and just following accessibility guidelines on that. And I think it is really helpful actually to do. So yeah, So I'm going to start by talking about the People's Bank of Govanhill, which is a long-term collaborative project that evolved quite organically from a residency that I did with Govanhill Basque Community Trust when I first moved back to Scotland in 2014. And it began very much as a series of currency experiments and quite ad hoc exchanges, on the street discussions. We started out with, it really began as a kind of one woman experiment into this idea of community currency. It was around about the time when Scotland was just about to have, or had just had, its independence referendum. So there were a lot of conversations about independence and what forms independence might take. What does independence look like at a local level? And so this conversation about kind of independent currency came up. And I initially screen printed a set of notes for the People's Bank of Govanhill, which was part of a project that I was doing for the residency, imagining there was an archiving work going on in the baths at the time, looking back over the last 100 years, and I had created these kind of artifacts that would be snuck in amongst the archive, but dated at various points in the next century. And I'd had a lot of conversations with people in the kind of local area and people who volunteered for the baths and about what kinds of things we might like to see. So quite an optimistic view of the future. And one of the things that I did was I printed this set of People's Bank of Govanhill notes. You could exchange, I had an exchange booth at the kind of opening of an exhibition, which was meant to be the end of my residency, really. And people got these notes, and really it was just supposed to be the planting of a seed of an idea, just putting it out there. But people were really into it, and once people had the notes, they wanted to know what was going to happen next. So it was kind of born as a project almost by accident, really, and has now been carrying on so that was in 2014, yeah, so it's kind of almost 7 years that it's been a kind of ongoing work. And I always think it's quite interesting to just talk a bit about how it evolved so organically and was quite kind of led by people's interest rather than me kind of coming in and saying, we're going to set up a community economies project. Yeah, and it has very much grown into a long-term work, mapping the local economy, expanding our ideas of community currency and looking at how we can put feminist economics into practice in our local community. And it's grown into a collaboration with other artists, academics, activists, and local residents. And in 2017, the People's Bank of Govanhill became a collective with a written constitution, which was crowdsourced, kind of in this mobile booth that I went around the streets with, doing things like, so this is an image from a time bank tombola, which was a kind of randomized system of exchange. So the project is now collectively managed by a collective. We call ourselves the Feminist Exchange Network, and we set up as a community interest company in 2020. That might be something, if people are interested in that, maybe we can talk a bit more at the end about governance structures and what it means to deliver a feminist and anti-capitalist project within these structures where we're reliant on getting funding in order to do our work, and how we kind of navigate operating within sometimes quite neoliberal structures. So, what does it mean to try and have a more kind of radical feminist governance, but still have to navigate the world that we all live in? And it's a work that very much looks at the global economy while thinking in practical terms about what we can do at a local level. And one of the things that I have drawn on quite a lot over the time that I've been doing this work, and you'll probably be familiar with this if you've been looking at Catherine Gibson's work, but the feminist metaphor of the economy as an iceberg. So just for anyone who's not familiar with that metaphor really describes the economy as an iceberg, so that above the waterline, the tip of the iceberg, the bit that we normally see, is the profit-making economy. But below that is the bulk of the iceberg, the stuff that keeps us afloat, the stuff without which we couldn't survive. So subsistence work, care, domestic labour, all of these things come into that kind of unseen part of the economy that keeps us afloat. So this is me dressed as economy as an iceberg in Tina's chip shop in Govanhill. So a lot of the work that I've done has been about finding accessible ways to talk about the idea of feminist economics, trying to take it away from an academic discourse, make it into something that people would really interact with. And I did this as a performance in chip shops, kebab houses, on the street, inviting people just to add to and interact with it. I sometimes describe it as a kind of anti-Mr. Wimpy. I don't know if people can remember who Mr. Wimpy was, but he's like a guy that used to go around advertising fast food restaurants in a big suit. So yeah, and yeah, I think also one of the things that I always find very important to say is that feminist economics isn't about a women's economy. It's about valuing the forms of labour and ways of being that have been deliberately devalued under capitalism or feminised, and that our feminism is trans and non-binary inclusive. So alongside all of this work, one of the things that I've been developing quite long term is this mapping process for mapping the local economy and exchange networks. It started out as a means of trying to find out what already exists, what sort of exchanges were already taking place, but also where the gaps are. So where could we connect a bit more? And this set of visual codes were developed initially with women's groups in Govanhill to create maps of intersecting economies below the waterline. And I started out just with these 3 really simple print block symbols, partly because Govanhill is a very Scotland's most diverse area, which in comparison to some parts of the world will not necessarily be hugely diverse, but there are about over kind of 60 different languages spoken in a very small area. So trying to find a way of communicating visually. Also, a lot of women, particularly in the Roma community, wouldn't necessarily be used to holding pens, so it was quite important to have a way of mark making and communicating that it was also not about drawing. So, and I began with these 3 stamps, and every time I've done workshops, people have kind of said, well, we could do with a symbol for this. So then we think about what that symbol would look like, we draw it and add the symbol. So we've now got quite an extensive map key of different symbols. So yeah, just this way of creating maps of the intersecting economies below the waterline. Yes, and we have this set of stamps that can be used by groups and individuals and organisations to map both our monetary and non-monetary economy or support networks, to allow us to chart existing connections, but to see where the gaps are. And it's often a very useful tool for showing where power lies as well, where decision making happens. And I've used this quite a lot in other kind of commissions and residencies outside of Govanhill as well. It's become a kind of process that I've used a lot in my work. So I'm going to suggest that we have a 1-minute screen break now, just for a minute. But if you would like to, whatever you want to do, turn your camera off for a minute if you want, or just close your eyes, and I'll shut everyone back in 1 minute. Hi. So that's been a minute. If everybody feels like that's a long enough screen break, you can come back.
I just watered my plants.
Nice. Yeah, it's really pretty nice to do something like that really is away from your screen for that minute if you can. So I think that looks like people are mostly back. If you need to take longer than a minute for these, though, then just do. So in 2018, we opened a community exchange space called Swap Market. This is an image of Swap Market. It's on what you might describe as Govanhill's kind of high street. And it was really, we ended up opening this space as a result of all of this, what I would now maybe describe as research and development, or research into community exchange, in response to people saying that we really needed a base, that the kind of moving around ad hoc stuff popping up all over the place was fine, but people wanted to know where they could find us and when. And a place to come together, a place that would be, you know, we were connecting quite a lot with quite a lot of different groups, but often kind of going to those groups, and we were interested in whether we could create a space for people to really come together and exchange, and to kind of focus some of these discussions and to facilitate not just the exchange of stuff, which it was on the face of it a kind of simple swap shop where people could exchange stuff, but it also worked as a skills and knowledge exchange, a workshop space, the exchange of goods, but also of traditions and cultures, and yeah, it did become a space for shared learning, really. A space to work together to look at how feminist economics can be put into practice. And we regularly had talks from artists, activists, local residents, gigs, music events, games nights, film screenings, Skillshare events. And in the 2 years that we ran the space, the Swap Market membership grew really rapidly. We imagined that when we opened this space, we were going to have to do a lot of work getting people in. I thought we'd be out in the street with little flyers, and actually we were we were kind of inundated with people from day one, which was, yeah, like not what we'd expected. The membership grew pretty rapidly to almost 2,000 local residents. Almost 2,000 people were signed up as members in the 2 years that we had the space open. A really diverse membership, very representative of the local community. It was very well used by the local Roma community. A lot of Muslim women used the space. And the space was really run by a team of absolutely incredible women, very multilingual staff. And there was a real diversity of languages kind of spoken within the Swap Market. We tried as much as we could to kind of do everything in multiple languages. So while in a lot of ways that was really amazing that we got this big influx of people and lots of people wanting to use it, it wasn't without its challenges. None of us had ever run anything like this before. We'd never managed funding at that scale before. We are sort of the Feminist Exchange Network, as we are now, we're a team of volunteer co-directors. We occasionally can pay ourselves for bits of work when funding comes in, but essentially as co-directors we are, like with most kind of CICs, charities, that kind of structure, we're essentially volunteers for the most part. All of the kind of managing of funds, fundraising, all of that as usual happens unpaid. Yeah, and just so there's a lot of challenges around this kind of rapid expansion of the project, and the sort of thing that sounds absolutely amazing to funders. Funders love the idea that we got this really diverse membership really quickly, but actually it was quite challenging, and also sometimes and brilliant, really brilliant at times as well. And like, you know, this is kind of one of the events that we had where there's lots of different things going on at once, lots of different groups of people all kind of using the space. Yeah, but by the time we had to close the project in March 2020, which we obviously had to close the space, like most spaces that had a lot of social interaction, people coming together, we had to shut our doors last year. But we'd already begun to think about how to slow things down a little bit. and think quite carefully about the idea of growth and expansion and what kind of growth we wanted for the project. Given that we were proposing an alternative to the model of exponential growth in GDP, how did we actually want to grow as a feminist organisation? So we used, over the kind of initial 6 months, I think, of the kind of pandemic, we used the window spaces quite a lot, and different groups took over the window spaces to kind of use those window spaces as a means of communicating. We did online events as well, which were great and really brought in quite an international audience, but we were also very, very aware that around about 50% of our membership of the spot market were not people who had regular access to the internet, mostly because a lot of people who were using the project were people who were living in quite extreme poverty a lot of the time. And so there's a real digital disparity, and we had to do a lot of thinking about how we could kind of continue that work and it not just become a series of online events. And yeah, so like a lot of grassroots projects and organisations, suffered some pretty major funding cuts over the last year, and have in quite a lot of ways been stripped of our means of production, to be perfectly honest, which has meant that we've had to rethink the way that we work. That's not all been bad. We have come up with some kind of interesting new ways of working. We've lost our venue now, so using the windows in this way is not something we're able to do. But to be honest, the way that we used to work, holding these packed out events with people standing shoulder to shoulder, has become impossible, and currently feels like I don't know if we're ever really going to be able to operate in that kind of way. You know, food was always quite central to our events as well, the sharing of food, people passing things around, breathing on each other, all of that stuff that now kind of seems a bit unthinkable. So I'm really interested, and maybe this is something again that people might like to pick up in the conversation afterwards, but I'm very, very interested in how people are kind of having a kind of social and collaborative practice at the minute, because obviously I've been doing this kind of work for around 20 years, and the kind of methodologies for the most part that I've developed have become redundant, and having to really think quite quickly about alternatives. So this is one of the window images. This is a drawing that I did, which was depicting capitalism as the virus, so kind of early on in lockdown, and just kind of wanting to talk about the fact that actually the thing really that was hurting us all and continues to hurt us all is not necessarily COVID, is it? It's all of the things that cause virus to spread so rapidly, and all of the other kinds of hurt and things that their kind of capitalist economic model causes. So that was in the window for a few weeks, and then we had this kind of rotating programme. So I'm going to suggest another very quick 1 minute screen break, if that's okay. Cool. Hi, that's another minute if people are good to come back. So I'm going to jump back in time a little bit for this next bit of the talk. I'll just wait and see if everybody looks like they're back. I know some people have got their cameras off anyway, so okay. Yeah, so I'm going to jump back in time a little bit here and to talk about some other work that happened that I initiated within the swap market. So kind of alongside the swap market and also within the swap market project, I'd begun to look at how we might incorporate digital technologies into this work on feminist and community economies, mostly through a collaboration with a designer called Bettina Nissen that started in 2019. If it's inevitable that we're moving towards a cashless society where machines and technology have an ever-increasing impact on our lives, we wanted to know how we could do this in a way that empowers people, enables us to share resources across networks and meets our needs, rather than allowing technology to further disempower people and exacerbate inequality. And we wanted to know how we could use technology to act in solidarity and create translocal networks, which has become an especially pertinent question in times of isolation and social distancing recently. So my collaboration with Bettina Nissen began looking at the potential for a feminist cryptocurrency, inspired by a shared interest in feminist economics and the potential for emerging technologies to disrupt established power structures and create new networks. We quite broadly interpreted the term cryptocurrency, thinking of that quite simply as a decentralized network of transactions that incorporate an agreed set of values or ethics. And the work that we did brought together Bettina's work making the less visible processes behind tech more visible and tangible, and the work that I'd been doing visualizing the invisible and less tangible aspects of the economy, such as emotional labour or the below the waterline economy. So we began this work back in 2019 with a series of workshops based at Swap Market, exploring possible uses of new technology and community currency, using craft as a metaphor quite often. Thinking about how we ensure that the bias and prejudice of today are not coded into the tech of the future. Could we use new technologies to distribute power? And thinking very carefully about what tech we might find useful in a community currency context, but also where we don't want the technology, where things are actually functioning very well by themselves. We were looking a lot at, we're really interested in the potential of tech like blockchain, but we're also aware that some of the examples of the use of blockchain in community currencies really looked very much like bringing the technology in to control or observe an economy that actually functioned perfectly well outside of the mainstream economy. So we were kind of wary, and a lot of the discussions that we had in the swap market were around people's concerns about the technology and technology as a means of surveillance and control, which again I think is a conversation that has really come to the fore over the last year. So yeah, well, we were interested in the potential of tech like blockchain. We were concerned about these kind of what are the kind of implications of those technologies as well. And we began with a series, we kind of came up with this experiment in collectively coding value into currency. So the spot market at the time had a fluctuating exchange rate that was determined by the staff. The staff would kind of change the rate of exchange on a kind of daily or weekly basis, kind of depending on what sort of things they got in, and working to supply and demand really, but in the opposite way from the capitalist system. So in the winter, when warm coats were needed, warm coats would be available. If you donated a warm coat, you would get lots of points because that would encourage you to donate them. But if you needed a warm coat, it would be you could get a coat for 1 point or something, because we needed to get as many coats out to people as possible. So we're kind of interested in playing around with that a little bit more and creating an interactive exchange rate that would allow the swap market members to collectively determine the value of things exchanged or knowledge shared. So we had like this rate of exchange board that kind of, and a series of knobs that you could turn up and down different values. It's quite a playful way as well. So again, like kind of always sort of bringing these quite I guess, quite big and serious academic conversations, kind of trying to have them in a way that's quite playful and quite accessible. And but yeah, that work just raised a lot of really interesting questions. So some of them I've already talked about, but also things like, would a feminist digital currency network be necessarily based in a geographical community, or did we want to look at connecting with other community economy groups in other parts of the world? Yeah, how would that allow us to interconnect with other feminist economies globally? What sorts of things might we want to share across those networks? Was it stuff? Is it more knowledge-based? A really interesting question that kept coming up about whether we wanted a hack-proof system, or actually did we want a framework that allowed people to adapt and change in a more open source way? And who has the power to change a system if not everyone is a computer programmer? Does the power always lie with the programmer? And throughout all of this research, the thing that we kept coming back to was the need to collectively share the knowledge and experiential learning that happens in community activism, and to find better ways of caring for each other. And conversations about care really dominated the workshops. Interestingly, that was in 2019, and I really have noticed that over the last year, those conversations about care that we were kind of already having in the swap market have really kind of started to come into the mainstream. And could we co-design a system for sharing experiential learning based on a principle of mutual care? So to kind of jump back to feminist perspective on economics, we currently live under an economic doctrine that was built on the model of the rational, autonomous man, the concept of a man who is free from caring responsibilities. He's probably white and he's probably cisgendered. He acts entirely and care being something that's difficult and a set of skills that have to be learned and constantly improved and worked at. So I'm going to do another minute screen break and then I'm going to jump on to talking about the kind of development of that work. So hi. So that's about a minute if people want to come back. I hope these screen breaks are helping people with the sense of digital fatigue. So I'm going to talk now about a piece of work called String Figures that I've been working on for about the past year. Bettina and I began conceptualizing string figures at the end of 2019. And it's been really interesting to see these new conversations about care that have really been coming to the fore over this last year. String Figures takes its title from techno-feminist Donna Haraway's metaphor for the inextricable threads that connect us all. And over this last year, I've been working with Bettina Nissen and creative technologist Bob Moyler to co-design a prototype collaborative software for collective organising, centred on a principle of mutual care and cooperation. So that was adapted from the print block mapping toolkit that I designed back in 2016 for the People's Bank of Govanhill. The print blocks that we held in our hands and often passed around while sharing food, sitting close and talking intimately, are, for now at least, redundant. So I wanted to know if there was something of the intimacy of that process that we could recreate digitally, where we still felt connected and could work creatively to organise together online. And this last year has also really opened up more international or translocal, as we're often describing them, opportunities for collaboration and collective organising across borders. I'm just going to read a little bit that I wrote recently for Antipode, kind of about the string figures project. A lot has been written about care this last year. As multiple crises unfold and we work out how to reorganise our lives both online and off to meet our needs, the ways that we connect and care for each other have shifted into new territory. So much profit-driven work has been deemed essential. Meanwhile, much of the work of activists, artists, and community organisers is considered a danger to public health. We're stripped of our means of production, left with this feeling of impotency in the face of economic, social, environmental, and health crises. We urgently need new ways to connect and care for each other, but trying to build a new inclusive system of care on platforms owned by rich white venture capitalist men just feels counterintuitive. Mutual aid facilitated by WhatsApp group, Zoom and Google Docs looks like a sticking plaster on a scarred and dismantled public service in a state that really only cares about care when it damages profit, while enabling the surveillance capitalism nightmare to advance at a rapid pace. It's really important that we learn how to care better, to look out for each other in times of crisis, and incorporate that care and love and attention into every aspect of our lives and our activism, and to keep making space for pleasure and joy. But in working out how to really love each other in the face of a world driven by individualism and competition, the care network itself isn't enough. It's there to support us and keep us collectively strong, to make our networks accessible and inclusive, to help us stay passionate about building the futures that we need, articulate and raise our collective voice. But it is not a substitute for revolutionary work. We still need radical systemic change. So through the initial string figures workshops, as we developed the prototyping quite a kind of iterative way through a series of workshops with participant groups who had kind of I'd kind of signed up to the project really to build these networks, but also with the understanding that they would kind of be involved in shaping how the technology developed. And through the initial string figures workshops, the busy maps and string figures that we created together reflect the messiness of feminist working, the non-linear paths of creative practice, layered diagrams of things we need and ways to connect and ways to care together that we discussed. And these maps are kind of encrypted to everyone but the participants, and the information is only ever shared with full consent. String figures has been described as a space for collaboration that is joyful to use, that takes our thinking and our imagining into a different kind of virtual space, away from the headfuck of the video call, where we can imagine new worlds together and make space to ask for the things that we need as we build decentralized support networks through visual diagrams. So in the workshops, we started thinking about our needs in relation to our political work. And then we moved more specifically into how we might meet those needs and achieve the collective aims that we'd established and identified. Some of the needs that we mapped were immediate, like friendship and allyship at a time when hate speech has risen. Other collective needs are long-term, like the idea of a funding syndicate, where we might look to fundraise collectively as a community, working together rather than competing for funds. finding radical new ways to be better allies. For those of us with fundraising experience, to work in a community collective where people who have been excluded from funding applications due to language or other parameters set out by neoliberal funding bodies. And we kept coming back all the time to this conversation about the need to redefine collective action and collaboration in times of social distancing in a way that doesn't draw us further into over-reliance on big tech. So we talked a lot about how to take care of each other when working with technology, how to care for ourselves when working online. Oh. As our every experience is commodified online and our interrelationships are increasingly trackable, traceable, and data mineable, how could we take more care in our digital lives? What about all of the unseen exploitation that allows us to work online and connect with each other? The energy, the land, the labour, the mineral use and mining that make digital working possible for those of us with the privileges to access it. We wanted to know how to extend our ethic of care and consideration, taking care to reduce the exploitation of real people and natural resources. And how might we move towards a digital commons, one where our data is not owned by rich white men and used against us to control our thoughts and modify our behaviours. Bob Moyler, the creative technologist that I worked with on the project, talked about keeping the technology deliberately light. So there's no database. We don't gather any data on people. Our refusal to gather data through string figures is not just about our collective privacy and avoiding surveillance, although that is vital as well. There are energy and land implications each time data is sent or gathered. So string figures has no unnecessary server storage of data, and the application only does what is absolutely necessary to serve as a conduit for the collaborative mapping process. If the Web 2.0 is a fucked up, racist, transphobic, misogynist shit show of extraction and exploitation, then let's imagine the feminist tools of a new web, a digital commons where we can pool our collective resources to build the systems we need to support each other. A space where we're not mind controlled by state corporate collaborations, but able to collaborate with our peers in a way that can never be owned or co-opted or sold back to us. So I'm going to post a link to the string figures software when we kind of come out of the slideshow. I'll post a link in the chat. And if anyone wants to test out, there's a demo version of string figures that you can have a bit of a play with. So I'm just going to finish up by talking about quite briefly about kind of how we're moving forwards with the Feminist Exchange Network and how we're kind of doing the swap market things without a venue. And that'll just be quite a little short bit, but I would just suggest that we have another little minute screen break before that. Okay. Hi. So that's another minute screen break if people would like to rejoin us. So for this last little bit, I'm just going to jump back now to talk about some of the plans that we have as Feminist Exchange Network over the coming year. working with a much reduced budget and no venue. So kind of almost back to a similar position to where we were in the beginning. So yeah, so two things that we're looking at. One is to carry on developing that collective fundraising idea, working with other local groups in the area to talk around funding cooperatives and syndicates and carry forward the conversations that we began through String Figures on how to fundraise more collectively as a community, and also kind of bringing in some of the blockchain conversations that we had and looking at how technology could be useful in that process. And then these very sketchy last slides are sketchbook sketches for a feminist economics cooperative football match. So not just thinking about how we operate without a venue, but also how we continue some of the exchange of ideas that we established through the swap market project, continue to talk about some of the ideas that we were discussing, but also how to do that within current restrictions. Yeah, without a venue, and also how do you do that kind of social and collaborative arts practice through ongoing social distancing? So I'm not sure where you're at in other parts of the world, but here in Scotland, the plan at the minute, obviously could all go to pot, but the plan at the minute is for outdoor contact sport to resume from next month. So we're planning a football match because there's no plan to resume collaborative art practice anytime soon, as far as I can see. So we're planning a feminist economic cooperative football match. It'll be an outdoor event that takes the form of a 5-a-side 3-team football match, enabling us to connect with people who are not using or don't have access to digital platforms. And then the event's also going to be kind of live in the park, participatory, but filmed and can be kind of shared through film screenings at the local Govanhill Film Festival. And it continues that work that we've been doing of bringing ideas of feminist economics, decolonisation and degrowth to a local audience, and kind of making connections between these kind of conversations, like as we're talking more and more in Scotland about decolonisation and anti-racist work. How does that relate to feminist economics? How does it relate to action on climate change and caring for our natural environment? And as the COVID crisis has really highlighted the problems of capitalist structures and economies, we're seeing increasing shifts, I think, in common language towards solidarity economies, mutual aid and collaboration over competition. The concepts that have always been at the heart of feminist economics, ideas that we've been working through and talking about in local community through the Swap Market project since 2018 and earlier. And yeah, and trying to kind of, so Cobh is coming to Glasgow, or should, the conference of parties on action for climate change is supposed to be happening in Glasgow in November this year. So we're kind of doing this in the run up to Cobh as well, to try and bring in those conversations about climate action and kind of care beyond just sort of interspecies care and planetary care. So the 5-a-side match will be based on the rules of 3-sided football that were developed in the 1960s by anarchist groups and the situationists. The game, the cooperative football game, really is about exploring how cooperative behaviours can help break down the competitive basis of capitalist organisation. So our match, there'll be 3 feminist football teams, each representing a key theme: decolonisation, degrowth and climate action. So themes that have enough overlap for the need for collaboration, but enough difference to necessitate the negotiation of key priorities within the match. We're going to have live football commentary, commenting on the alliances and connections made across the 3 teams. So inviting 3 feminist speakers who would deliver talks and workshops as part of the Swap Market programme to act as commentators for the event. So it should be quite fun, and in the style of traditional football commentary, which is usually quite a male-dominated domain. So we've got a call out at the minute for female identifying and non-binary footballers. So if anyone knows anyone in Glasgow who's good at football and might be interested, then let them know. And we've got working with an artist called Mandy Roberts, who is designing football strips for the 3 teams that are going to be kind of upcycled from donated football strips. So that's where we're at. I will stop sharing my screen, and before I forget to do this, I will post in to the chat the link for the string figures software. If anyone feels like having a play with this at any point, the link's there in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Ailie. It has been absolutely, I mean, I don't know what to say. Fascinating, incredible. So much work, so many things. I mean, these presentations always only briefly describe what the project is about or the set of ideas. You know, we all know that a lot is what goes into actually being able to even speak about something like this. It's so incredible. So I usually just launch first question for the discussion, and then we open up to everyone. It's very informal. Everyone can just unmute themselves and ask a question or make a comment. So I took a lot of notes here, but I think one of the most early on, when you were introducing your practice and talking about what you've been doing, you clearly, and I could see a lot of political narratives and ideology informing lots of work, references from you just mentioned now, anarchists and international situationism to, theory. But clearly you suggested that the ambition to the practice is to try to translate or articulate some thinking that might take place in academia into action, right? And I'm not an artist. I'm not a practitioner in the arts. I'm a curator. My background is in humanities, so I always refer to theories and thinkers and concepts. And so I was really interested in, you have lots of discourse, a lot is very well put together, but it's really informing what is happening in the ground. So I'm curious about that. Like, you refer to methodologies which are no longer valid in, say, in the context of social distancing. You develop a new methodology or a new tool towards that. I'm really interested in, how do you feel like the need for that? Was that a need, or was it because you were finding issues in accessibility or in providing access to participants in projects to some of these ideas? Or is it a more kind of a self-led decision at some point where you want to be active in the field and not necessarily only translating theory into work? So maybe I'm not asking a question, it's more a comment, but I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think
20 hours.
Oh.
No, it's fine. It's my computer.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably describe myself as fairly activist, as just a citizen outside of my arts practice. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive things, are they? But yeah, and I guess also have I'm absolutely not an academic, but have done a fair amount of study, and I guess have sometimes quite academic interests. But I often so the thing that I didn't talk about was that while I was doing the residency with the Govanhill Basque Community Trust, which is very much an organisation that is very embedded in the local community and has been founded on some very direct political action, and is run and organised by some very, very passionate political people who are very much about on the ground working. I was also doing a little bit of research at Glasgow Women's Library, which is really where my interest in feminist economics took off. But I think I felt quite frustrated by that gap, which is often there between the kind of theory and the practice, and the kind of lack of, which J.K. Gibson Graham obviously do really well, particularly with Take Back the Economy, but the lack of kind of taking those more academic ideas and describing them in ways that were kind of relevant and meaningful to people outside of academia. So yeah, I was quite excited when I discovered the work of J.K. Gibson Graham. I've had the pleasure of working with Catherine Gibson when she came to Glasgow as well, which is really brilliant. And yeah, maybe quite inspired actually by kind of looking at those things and thinking, well, what does this mean? And like I was saying, that a lot of the work that I have, a lot of this work has really developed quite organically, and I think that's something that's actually quite important in social practice. And I've been able to work quite long term because I'm working somewhere that's quite close to where I live. It really changes the way you can work. It's very different to if you're working as a visiting artist on a short-term residency or something. The kind of way you're able to engage, the things you're able to do, and the way you can allow stuff to kind of happen quite organically and work in response to what you see working in a community, or what people come back to you and say, I was really interested in this, and you know, there's the time to think about where it goes. You know, like I do quite often, not as much this last year, but previously, like most artists do, sort of travel for residencies and things, and that work is quite different. You know, I've sort of specifically spoken this evening about work that is quite long-term embedded in a place that's very local to where I live and work. Oh, you're on mute.
No, I mean, I was saying that, yeah, exactly. That was the point I wanted also to explore. It's this embedding, you know, working in a very localized, in very specific context, but also committing yourself to a long-term engagement and involvement with a specific group or community or organization or practice, which is completely different from the speculative capitalist art world. But on the other hand, it's more and more, so in my shift or involvement in social practice, the key question has always been a crucial ethical issue around the involvement of participants, collaborators in a specific project coming from a community context, and the moment in which the project somehow is no longer sustainable for reasons that are beyond our control, or purposefully because the artist moves away, or the curators move away, or there's a shift in relationships, in power structures, and so on. And so this ethical question around the symbolic power that people in the arts develop at the expense of participants in, say, social engaged projects, and how to how to create an alternative to that, or a barrier to that. And I come to realize that it's about embedding and creating sustainability and long-term commitment, which is not easy for all sorts of reasons. So I was really struck when I came across the work. I was really impressed by that longevity of the project. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that.
So, I mean, I think what's quite interesting to talk about within that is that this has been a long-term project. I quite often think that there may well come a time where I leave the Feminist Exchange Network. I'm no longer, or I become an associate member, and I'm no longer the artistic director on that board. I'd like to think that might be possible at some point, that it doesn't actually hinge on me anymore. And that's kind of something that I've been trying to, it's not necessarily what I'm working towards, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. It's quite different to the way that you're taught to be an artist, though. You know, it's in part about trying to sort of dismantle that artist ego that you're taught to have at an art school, isn't it? But also the swap market project, we did have a lot of artists who came in and out short term. So I think that's maybe the crucial thing in the type of work that you're talking about, that you have something that is very embedded in the local community, that's there long term, that isn't just a parachuting in, but because you have that structure and that long-term connection and that really meaningful connection, you can kind of allow other artists or creative practitioners or activists or whoever it is to kind of come in on a shorter term basis. So we did all sorts of things in the 2 years of the swap market, and the huge number of different artists who got involved in quite different ways. You know, from kind of young creative technologist Libby O'Dye, who worked with Bettina and myself on setting up the interactive exchange rate that I looked at, different artists doing window displays on different related themes. We ran a couple of residencies, you know, different artists coming in to kind of document projects. And I mean, if you look at the website for the People's Bank of Govanhill, we've got a pretty long list now of kind of artists and activists who've been involved in that project. And for some of those people have been involved quite long term. Others are kind of artists who we've had, you know, other bits, smaller bits of funding where we've been able to provide opportunities for other artists to do a proposal for a window installation or a series of kind of smaller scale works within the project, or to run little exchanges and workshops. So I think you can, you know, I don't think it's always the case that the kind of the parachuting in artist is always a negative thing, but I think you have to have that longer term structure there that allows for the visiting artist or the shorter term work to be meaningful within a bigger context. You're on mute.
I'm just handing over to Colette or to Fiona or to Anna or anyone else.
Yeah, a couple of things I'd like to maybe say. I guess one thing you'd mentioned earlier, which would be really great to know a little bit more about, is the governance structure. But before we maybe go into talking about that, I was watching stuff recently about Web 3.0 and that these sort of new technologies that are being developed at the moment for decentralizing the web and power structures. And one thing that was being said about it was the people who are designing it are effectively engineers, and that was being seen as a problem. And in fact, I guess what there was a call for was more of a kind of a multidisciplinary approach to designing, which sounds to me like there's a user-led sort of approach in terms of what you're doing and the way that you're, you know, making them the string project, the string figures project, which is, you know, it's being tested by users, and then in response to that, technology developers are actually incorporating those factors. But I do think on the main that it is a sort of an engineer's project at the moment, from what I've been hearing and for what people have been kind of generally saying. But yeah, it is a kind of an interesting moment at the moment in terms of these new possibilities that are beginning to emerge, and these sort of outmoded techno giants of like Google and Facebook and Twitter and stuff are becoming archaic, but, you know, like everything, will adapt quite quickly, no doubt. But anyway, so just maybe you wanted to say something about that, but also just maybe talk a little bit about the governance structure as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that there's sort of two things about governance here, isn't it? There's one that's about, I mean, I think the conversations that we're having about the digital realm, the web at the minute are really interesting because they're quite transferable to offline working as well. You know, it's the same set of problems, you know, surveillance capitalism. The problem with surveillance capitalism is capitalism, you know. So yeah, I don't know whether to start with talking about the sort of governance structure of the sort of more offline stuff or not. But I mean, I'm particularly interested in these conversations, as you say, about decentralizing the web, but does the power always lie with the programmer? By and large, most programmers are still men, very much so. The sort of tech courses don't really teach ethics. It's a bit like economics, actually. Most of the time, tech and programming and economics are taught as if they are politically neutral, which they're not. But students aren't really taught to think about ethics or to kind of question the baseline of capitalism or question the baseline of the programmer as the sort of as the powerful person. There's a really, really interesting podcast series that I've been listening to on Bot Populi. I don't know if people know about Bot Populi, but they're a digital justice network. Back in 2014, they did a lot of really, really interesting work around the idea of a feminist internet. and produced a feminist internet manifesto, which there's two feminist internet manifestos. There's a .com and a .org. So their one is the both really great, actually, both really interesting. The .org one I think is more interesting, very much comes from a global south perspective. So it really, really challenges the dominance of the kind of white Western male in terms of the internet. And they've got Bob Popular doing a really excellent podcast series looking at the idea of a feminist social media and what that would look like. Really, really recommend listening to them. Each one's only about 20 minutes long, and it's just the women that they talk to are absolutely brilliant. But, you know, I think one of the things that it comes back to all the time is, I guess, this question of like, can we ever use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? You know, or do we actually just need to lay down those tools and build our own tools? And again, the need for more women, more trans women to be involved in programming, more, you know, there's always these conversations always come back to like more young women in the global south being programmers is actually the thing that will shift the dynamic. And that's a kind of, there are these kind of recurring themes in all of the conversations. So yeah, I don't think I can answer that question anything like as well as anyone in those podcasts, so I would just listen to them.
Ailie, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was such a great talk. Really, really interesting to see your work. And I have a question that sort of sounds like it's a practical question, but of course it's you know, it's a question about labor and, you know, the economies of this kind of work. And so I was wondering whether you with the swap market, whether you were able to have paid employees, or was it all done around voluntary labor?
Sure, yeah, I usually talk about that actually. I forgot to include that in the talk this evening. Yeah, so we were very, very clear that people would be paid for their labour and paid quite well for any labour. Yeah, so it was interesting though, because there was always this assumption that all of the women who were working in the swap market were working for free, which wasn't the case, but that was yeah, very much the assumption. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, as often is the case, as a sort of board of directors, we often end up having to work for free. And I think that's really, it kind of goes back to the governance thing, but I think that's a really problematic model, because you, as a board of directors, we are ultimately the people with we might not be doing most of the work, and but we're ultimately the people with the decision-making powers, and who in all the earth can actually afford to work for free, who has the kind of necessary skills to do all of the really boring stuff like the fundraising and managing the funds and all of that sort of stuff, and is able to do that for free. And I think actually one of the reasons we became a CIC rather than some of the other models is that you can in theory remunerate yourself for some of that work if you manage to raise the funds, as opposed to say a board of a charity is necessarily a team of volunteers, which I just think it kind of harks back so much to this model of the probably male, probably white, probably retired old guy who's probably done a load of terrible work and wants to give something back at the end of his life. And actually, when you've got a bunch of women, usually with multiple caring responsibilities, women with disabilities, women from all kinds of different backgrounds, as our kind of board is, trying to fulfill those roles, it's a much trickier scenario. You know, like I would not be able to do the kind of work that I do without a lot of the privileges that I hold as a cisgendered white woman. I don't think I'd be able to do all this voluntary board type work. So yeah, I think there's always unpaid labour in there. So yeah, the women who were doing the bulk of the work in the swap market were paid, but we were, as a board, often unpaid. So yeah, I think it's a problem, and it's something that we keep thinking about, but haven't really come up with the answers yet. So if anybody has, please share.
I mean, it's a sort of double-edged sword, because you don't want to be always perpetuating a sort of gift economy thing around art production, but at the same time, there's a problem, isn't there, with kind of monetizing, you know, all work and all labor. You know, it kind of that is problematic in itself, and it's trying to find the balance kind of somehow between those two things. So just my last thing I'm going to say is, when you had members, were they just members, or was there like a membership fee, or was there a monetary aspect to the membership?
No, I mean, the membership has always been non-monetary. We've sort of decided that we have an associate membership, and the idea with when you sign up as an associate membership of there's two kinds of swap market members and feminist exchange network members, which are two slightly different things. So you could be a member of the swap market without necessarily being a member of the board. And we sort of set up this associate membership thing with the idea of trying to democratize the decision-making process a bit more, so people could come on and form steering groups and manage the project in some sort of smaller ways without having to make such a big commitment. But you could also literally just be a member of the project, which allowed you to come in and participate in exchanges. So we've kind of ended up with this kind of quite multi-layered setup, which now that we are not actually running that venue is perhaps less relevant. But I think that was our way of kind of trying to deal with it, was to have various different ways that people could be involved and part of the project.
Hi Ellie, my name's Steve. I'm with Cobh Zero Waste. So I was really interested to hear your talk tonight. There's so many things. I don't know where to start actually from all of the points you raised that are so relevant to us. We have had a vision 3 years ago of we actually live on an island in Cobh. So we had this vision of the island becoming fully sustainable, and a whole load of different kind of visions about what things could be like in the future. Just as you were saying, you kind of started off with your vision with your community currency. But we're very much an organization that, just grew up without any kind of formal organization as such. It's just a group of volunteers, and we've deliberately kept it so, and partly because we're scared of going and trying to, develop a kind of a co-op or anything, and all of the kind of work that's involved in that. And, we've never hired anybody because of all the terrible labor regulations and everything that you could get involved in. And it's actually worked quite well for these first 3 years. We've got on and we just do things. We're very much action oriented. And for somebody like myself, I'm a kind of I'm an economist by background, well, more agriculture, but I have a kind of an economics as well. It's really nice, as you say, to have that kind of practice, get away from the theory and actually get on with things. But we are in that position at the moment of having no base, no space. We do have a market stall now, which we do every month. And, that has been a really good way for us to collaborate and to get the community involved. But we don't have a space, and we are all volunteers. And, and so we're also thinking, how do we sustain this kind of organization? And we have looked at, you're like a collective, yeah? Is it collective, cooperative type of station?
We became a community interest company.
Okay.
After we're a cooperatively constituted community interest company. So kind of community interest company with cooperative values. Yeah.
I think that's where we'd like to go, really, but even that, when we look at it, is quite a daunting thing for a small group of volunteers. I mean, I don't think we have the numbers that you would have necessarily. And, we're in that kind of space now of where do we go? I'm working a lot on the idea that governments should be supporting community actions far more than they currently are. If we are going to transform society in the way that we need to, and we need to encourage a bottom-up approach, then I just can't see, why we're not getting more support from governments to fund like an organization within every community that can actually, that has paid resources and can actually start doing things about the social issues and the environmental issues that we need to address.
Yeah,
so I'm lobbying on that side.
Yeah. I think, you know, I don't know what the situation is in Ireland, but in Scotland, we kind of, something that we talked about a lot when we were running the spot market as well, you know, it didn't always go smoothly. There were, you know, we did encounter quite a lot of difficulties, and sometimes people felt very out of their depth because the funding structure is kind of such that a lot of funders really want something to be a new project, but also they want it to be entirely community led, community generated, very grassroots. That attracts a lot of funding, but it also, those funders are often very, very hands off, and there's not really much of a support system there. So there's a lot of devolved responsibility happens, and suddenly if you find yourself in a situation where something unexpected happened, which it almost definitely will if you've never run a project of that scale before, and you've suddenly been given a much larger pot of funding than you have. I mean, we didn't, it wasn't art. I had previously, everything I'd worked on had been arts funded, and we got Climate Challenge Fund money, which was way more than arts funding ever is. And yeah, so, but also that when the shit hit the fan occasionally, there was really no kind of support there, that there's this sort of system of, like, quite often government money going out, so, oh, we want it all to be community led, but as soon as you then have a community and a bunch of people trying to manage a project that they have not managed before, there's the kind of support that might need to be there in terms of, well, actually this thing has come up. Like, we had a few really difficult instances of things that we just hadn't expected coming up, and having to really work all kinds of crazy hours as an unpaid team to try and sort of go, well, what should we be doing in this situation? What's good practice? Who could we go to for advice? And you just sort of think that actually this kind of support for community organisations needs to be more than just monetary. It's not enough just to throw funding at people and go, right, you deal with those problems now, because, you know, we're not dealing with them in government, so we'll give communities money and you can sort it out yourselves. Is, you know, which is obviously where the kind of sort of Tory policy quite often goes, and seems to be kind of going at the minute, to sort of this whole kind of let's empower communities by just giving them their own services to manage for themselves. And I think you've got to be careful in terms of, like, lobbying for more communities to run things themselves, but at the same time you don't want to end up in some kind of nightmare big society scenario where any kind of state support is therefore annihilated. You know, like if we're pushing for a citizens' basic income, which I wholeheartedly think we should have, that also has to go along with a really, really good public healthcare system. You know, one is not a substitute for the other. So I just think we have to be careful in what we're lobbying for there as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, I think it's, you know, we had a fairly big grant that we managed to get recently, and we're having problems spending it in some ways, and actually just managing it. Well, we've had problems with COVID as well, but I do agree, because it's actually part of a bigger change that's needed, and and I think it's all about the use of money, isn't it? And so it's very interesting to hear you talk about the community currency ideas. Because even thinking about how money is used now and what's happened with COVID, and suddenly all this money is available that governments can, just because they can actually generate it if they want to. They're not like us as households, and so we've started to realise that actually money is a very different thing when it comes to governments, and we can use it in different ways, and we can actually do things about climate change. There should be absolutely no restriction on our ability to address climate change and to address social issues from a monetary point of view. I mean, there's just, those days now, the idea that there's restrictions on that should be long gone. And, and I think that's why we're kind of trying to push in this direction a little bit, but I agree, it's also about having people that are being trained, and and having the knowledge to actually run organizations and to actually implement these things. But yeah, that's very interesting that you talk about that, because I know we've had those issues ourselves about how big do we grow, and can we just continue to work in the way that we have been in the past.
Yeah, and I think it's really important sometimes to talk about the times when a project has been really difficult or the failings of a project. I think we are, and again, this is sort of capitalist model, isn't it? But we're encouraged as artists or anyone with any sort of a career to try and present the shiny model of things all the time and present everything as if it's a big, massive, shiny success. And, you know, there will be brilliant things about all kinds of work, but also I think it's really important to talk about the fact that sometimes it was really difficult and there were aspects of things that you did that didn't work very well and you had to radically rethink them on the kind of on the hoof.
Can I say something? Can I talk?
Yes, please.
My name is Ana. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I'm a fan of your work, as you know. I've been following the work you do, Ailie, for quite some years now, and I really enjoy every time I listen to the work you do and the way you do it. And as you were speaking, I was thinking through the lines that were just shared now, which are paid versus non-paid work, and whether or not what we need is monies, and when we got the monies, how we face the administration of the pockets of monies we get. And we had a recent experience with a big network of very small cooperatives that are here in Argentina. They are called cooperativas sociales, social cooperatives. And these kinds are managed by people who suffer from mental health issues, who are receiving support from public hospitals and different institutions across our territory. So they're all spread out. And they had formed a network 4 years ago. And the kind of work I've been doing, because I define myself as an activist and as a militant first and as a caregiver, but then I happen to work as a university professor as well and as a national researcher. And in combining all those roles, I had the fortune to be invited to work with that big network, which we are doing for some time now. And last year, we got quite a big pocket of funding from an Argentinian perspective. And what we are finding is that many times I'm speaking about this issue about the state funding these initiatives, because for us, the experience is being mixed. On the one hand, we're glad that we have monies because, like you said, people who many a time are, thought of as not getting monies for their work are getting it. On the other hand, administering a big pocket of money in Argentinian terms with a network that is spread out across the country has posed a lot of difficulty, mainly because the bureaucracy is after us every single day of our lives. I have like nightmares about all this. So I guess I'm now sharing just an experience. I'm not trying to theorize on this, but of course I can, or I could. But just also trying to pose here the issue of when is it a good synergy that volunteer and not volunteer work come together, and how to make that visible, because I think that it happens all the time. We all the time do volunteer work, or at least people like me do, and we believe in doing that way. And also, we also firmly believe that it's important that we have resources to pay for work because we don't want to exploit anybody else. But it's a tough issue. I'm not posing a question, I'm just sharing my experience. The other short experience I want to share, though, is related to visuals and arts. As a mom, I participated for 10 years in what is called here in Argentina, Parent-Teacher Association. And out of that work, we did a lot of neighborhood and community work, and we expanded out to the other neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. And we had a big network going on for cultural and arts and educational activities that were based on, again, volunteer and non-volunteer basis combined. And out of that, what we found, like you were saying, is that translating the things we do and the thoughts into artistic, visual, and body expressions was very important in order to bridge people from very different backgrounds. So I just wanted to comment on that very briefly, as I did, just to reaffirm that and say that I'm always very happy to hear you talk about those kinds of experiences as well.
Thanks. Is there, I think we're getting close to Marmy Miguel, but maybe I can see that Niamh has a hand up there. So
thanks so much for that. I actually, similar to Anna, I was going to ask about, that's a big open-ended question with the value of time as a currency as well, but maybe just on that note, I just wondered, when you mentioned earlier about another way of working now, I'm trying to practice as a socially engaged artist here at the moment as well, but in the light of everything, it's difficult to get off to a start, and it seems like we're going to be glued to Zoom for as far as we can see. But I was working on a project earlier in the year, and the group I was working with is a minority group, and they just didn't have the access to any of the maybe technology that we were given the option to use. So I just fell out a bit. I was happy to stand by them and wait until things could come back in, till we could meet in person again, because I really wanted to engage with them, and it was that was just the best way of working with them. But in the light of everything we're being pushed, it seems like we're going to be, it's great, the benefits are as much as well, but we're going to be maybe encouraged to stay on a virtual platform more. But with your looking at alternatives in the virtual climate, with any of your like with the exchange shop, obviously it's very important that it was in that space, but did you have besides the main fallout and spaces being closed in that, did you have any community that you just couldn't, empower through that technology, or how would you work around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that we have lost contact with quite a lot of people who used to come into the spot market, people who just dropped in on people who drop in for a cup of tea, on a really kind of ad hoc basis. That it is actually really, really hard, I think, at the minute, and it's something that we're all still trying to work out, is like how those kind of more informal, spontaneous interactions that I think really inform social practice, that aren't necessarily about people turning up to a specific event, or the way you can, drop into other people's spaces and projects, and those kinds of connections that you can build, or we used to be able to build in normal times. Maybe we're going to go back to that. I don't know. Yeah, how to navigate that is quite tricky, and we definitely, in having that physical spot market space, there would be particular events, but the much more ad hoc people who'd come in, quite often probably the most kind of more marginalized people in the local community were the people who would pop in for a cup of tea and a chat, really. And I think, to be perfectly honest, we have kind of lost touch with quite a lot of those people over the last year. It's very difficult to know what to do. We had a few conversations about also just things like kind of data protection. We might have had people's phone numbers but is it appropriate for us to phone them up and see how they're doing? And I think all of this sort of stuff that we're all really kind of navigating in terms of what it is to kind of maintain that sort of really meaningful engagement that you might have built up over quite a long-term project. And I mean, we did a lot of things like doing kind of poster projects in the local park and stuff. I managed to get a key for the notice boards in the local park, which was no mean feat, trying to find out who the key holder was and all of that sort of stuff. That is insanely time consuming. And so we did this kind of run of sort of poster projects, but you've kind of got no way of really telling who's interacting with that. It looks quite good as an output. You can photograph it and say that you did it, but actually in reality, I don't know who engaged with the poster project. Yeah, I mean, I think these questions around how we maintain a really meaningful social practice that is relevant to people who are quite often very marginalized by the structures that are in place. Yeah, how are we doing that just now? I don't know. I hope that we're finding ways to do it, and we're finding new innovative ways to do it. Connecting up with local mutual aid groups, working maybe with your local food banks and things like that, or maybe ways forward because they're maintaining contact. Yeah, big question.
Yeah, no easy answer, but just that it seems to be, unfortunately, they're the groups that are falling through the gaps of it. Yeah, so thanks.
But the quality, just maybe a final footnote. I mean, but when you presented these spring figures, you know, the digital tool that enables let's say collaborative practice to be developed with long distance through this long distance platform.
Yeah.
What kind of people are actually potentially knocking on your door to actually engage with this?
To use it.
Yeah.
So it's mostly been kind of small activist groups. So the first sort of trials that we did were kind of invited groups. So we had people from sort of like small kind of art activist projects, that people that I knew who did the very first sort of test iterations, and then we did a longer term project in the summer, which was kind of, so I should maybe mention as well that the kind of area of Glasgow that I'm working in is full of like really exciting, interesting activists and sort of social projects, which is not necessarily how everywhere looks, but there are a number of really interesting projects in the area, and we were looking at how we could kind of support each other better and kind of work kind of in between the gaps, and so that the kind of prototype was developed working very much with that collective of collectives. And then since then I've done other things. Did something at Money Lab a couple of weeks ago, which should have happened in Berlin, but obviously happened online. Again, that was kind of mostly people who were involved in some kind of activist work of some description, artists with social practice, people doing kind of social justice work. So it's, I mean, we do have a kind of thing on the String Figures About page where we say that we have specifically designed the software to be used by people who are doing anti-capitalist work. And I think we have a sort of set of kind of aims and ethics and intentions that we've published that were collectively produced. So like people who want to use the software beyond the demo version kind of have to get in touch and say, we're looking to build this kind of network. And then we can say, yeah, that looks really spot on, brilliant. Or we can say, actually, that's clearly quite a neoliberal project. Maybe this isn't for you.
No, it's no, because I suspect that independently of the ideology behind potential users, I would suspect that on one hand, say community organizers, or they would be, or people working in communities cohesion projects and so on, community development, they probably would be interested in the tool itself.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it might be also, it's quite interesting also that it comes from a very grassroots, and you know, you were very clear around questions around digital commons and so on. And I'm sure it's interesting how maybe I mean, when we were, I mean, going back to early email exchanges we had around even the use of Zoom being a platform that is paid rather than based on open source, it's interesting that like a tool like yours comes from your background, but not necessarily from a corporation where this social distancing need seems basically to have been shaping our last year, and probably within, I mean, I would continue to say at least in another 6 months or even more. So it's quite relevant, and I suspect there would be a lot of learning at that level about how to not substitute, but even in the future when face-to-face encounters will be able to take place, I believe that the learnings from operating within this kind of long-distance situation will still be valuable in some contexts that enable, on one hand, to have very embedded practices like we were describing, but on the other hand, to have larger possibility of having a larger connectivity.
Sure, definitely, yeah.
People and organizations. So, okay. Well,
yeah.
So anyone who wants to make a final comment or question? Okay. So I mean, I want to thank you so much for your time and for your generosity in sharing so much of your work and reflections. I feel that we will have a follow-up conversation soon. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, for those in Ireland in the evening, and for those in other continents in the afternoon. And I might also get back to you by email so that we can maybe follow up. And I can't tell exactly when it will be our next session, but we have on our schedule, so we know in April, we'll have one in May, one in June, and one in July. So it's on our Instagram page, on our link tree. You can see our program, and if you already registered, you don't need to register again. You just receive either information about the link. The links now are going to be all the same, but we look forward to welcome you in our next session and in continuing this work. Okay.
Well, I have just put in a link to the Bot Populi website that I mentioned in case anybody didn't get that, because I would totally recommend having a look at that.
Indeed. And so thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the evening. The talk will be uploaded into Sirius YouTube page. So if anyone wants to revisit it or share it with others, feel free, and enjoy the rest of the day, and see you soon.
Thanks a million.
That was great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you, Ailie.
Obrigada, gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias. Thank you.
Are you on mute? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.